Andy, and thanks everyone. And yeah, it's lovely to see so many familiar names in the participant list, and recognise from different parts of my life over the last 10 years of being in Scotland and actually elsewhere as well. So yeah, so just a story of how I got to this book, I guess. So because it's 2020, I have a podcast, or I host a podcast rather. So and it's not a side hustle actually. It's actually one of my jobs, I guess. So and the way it works, it's called Meditative Story. I'm not plugging it, but I'm just mainly to sort of explain the route to amateur. So the way it works is that every week someone tells a story about a sort of a pivotal moment in their life, and from all sorts of different walks of life. And the my I effectively do a couple of things. I do an intro to it, but also I based on the story and the theme of the story, I create a meditation sort of that jumps off the themes from the story, so that the podcast sort of flows into a meditation practice at the end. And I also pop up during the story with little sort of meditation prompts. And what that means is that sort of every week I receive a story from, so that it's based out in New York, and I receive a story on Google Drive, and so over the last year we've done almost 60 episodes. So actually over the last 2 years, 60 episodes, and so I've just taken on a lot of different people's stories and sort of snacked on a lot of people's lives. And when I'm trying to write a meditation based on someone's story, sometimes it's actually really hard because it's hard to find the practice. Sort of tricky to say, but it's hard for me to find a hook for me to go in, and just maybe the story is a bit flat or doesn't quite have the magic. But so one of the weeks, so Thomas Page McBee was one of our storytellers, and it was sort of the easiest story to write for, just because it was a beautifully told story, but also had so much sensuality to it, had so much reflective quality. It's all the ingredients that allowed me to allowed me sort of to wrap a practice around it. And it was just really, like, of all, like, some of the episodes sort of really just wash away in my mind, but actually this one's really stuck, one of the ones that really stuck with me. And I sort of followed that lead. And in the story, on the podcast episode, he tells the story of the fight. So and that's why I've got more deep into his work and this book in particular. So I'll say, maybe go to the next slide, Andy, and I'll say why, what it's about. So it's about, yeah, so it's you'll be familiar with this idea of like white collar boxing, right? So the idea of sort of bored hedge fund managers in their lunch break going to sort of boxing gyms and doing sort of amateur fights. And that's a phenomenon sort of in different sort of cities, and that happens in New York. And so as part of that, like, you know, because of the nature of those different sort of organizations, so there's some charities where you can basically, if you do the training and do the fundraising, you can do an amateur fight at Madison Square Gardens, you know, which is the sort of the holy place of boxing in the States, at least historically. And so sort of Thomas does that. He basically takes on the challenge for himself to train for a fight and train for a charity fight at Madison Square Garden. So like in one way of seeing this book, it's like one of those books about, it's like you see these books all the time, like a journalist who sort of comes up with a conceit for a book, and they're like a challenge book, right? And sells it to their publisher, and they're like, okay, that sounds fun. And then, you know, they do one of those every 2 years, and then that becomes their sort of thing. And I've become a bit sort of cynical about those kind of books. So when I sort of first saw Amateurs, oh, it's about this sort of, you know, he set up this conceit, and it's sort of artificial conceit to then tell a story around. But actually, it's not really about, like, it's not really about. It's very much around. So the because it's about what Thomas learns in the process. It's about The fight is really just the architecture for an exploration of him to understand or explore masculinity further. He's effectively like, you know, he's as a writer and as a journalist and as a commentator, his specialist subject is masculinity in the modern world. And and I guess one particular angle on that is that he's a trans man, and so it's very, very particular. So the real pitch of the book is like, you know, this is the story of the first trans man to fight at Madison Square Garden, but that's just the marketing picture. So it's much more about that, because I think it's about um uh I think it's really lovely, like really sort of dangerous question actually. It sort of started like, sort of primed at the front around why do men fight, and he sort of starts unraveling that. So that's what it's about. So it's very sort of compelling conceit, I think, or compelling idea. Andy? Um, so I guess the first thing I'll say is just like the first point is sort of very clear. Like the more I was sort of reading the book, is that like actually I don't know much about my sort of ignorance of the trans experience, I guess. And that was sort of a and yeah, that was just very like I found it quite uh because the book isn't about being trans, but it's just that's the lens, and yeah, that's uh who Thomas is. And so obviously he talks about that, and the impact of that in his training and so on. And you know, personally, like I do a lot. I read a lot of video games criticism as one of my that is a hobby, and 'cause I don't have time to play video games, but so I live like vicariously through reading about them, listening about them. And there are lots of trans video critics certainly in the spaces where which I think are good. And so I've sort of come across that experience. But that's very particular, and it's sort of about they don't necessarily talk about the experience of being trans in their writing. And so this is actually my first sort of reading of a more detailed story about from a trans writer, and that was really interesting to me, and interesting in the sense that like that it was my first, and also interesting to me in the more general sense of could it be a way to sort of understand more about people that I don't an experience, and people that I don't have a lot of experience with today. So that was sort of a meta point to start with. Andy? So there's a there's a I guess coming to the book, there's a sort of romantic idea of the in our culture of like the boxing ring, you know, the language, sort of the Norman Mailer, sort of, if you're sort of familiar with that sort of more sort of late 20th century, like romanticization of boxing and the dance, and you know, uh, uh, two men sort of dancing around in this environment, and like um, the the romanticization of the big fight, and that sort of all sort of plays through in the sort of marketing of modern sort of professional boxing. Um, but I think what was really like, but that's often very much like, but the lens that Thomas brought to it, you know, he does talk about how surprising, you know, because going into a locker room as a trans man, and not it's an interesting theme actually. He doesn't sort of although like, you know, he says very clearly, like if anyone were to look him up, you know, his identity as a writer is very much around being a trans writer, and so it wouldn't be very hard for any of the people in the gym to sort of Google his name and find out more about him. But he never declared it or spoke about it during the fight, during the in the gyms he trained at, and during the process. Other than to a couple of the organizers, just for sort of um, uh, legal reasons, which was interesting as well. That's a sort of a small sideline. Um, and so there's this really interesting theme of like how you know, he comes to this space in a way that most people don't come to that boxing training space, and his reflections on uh, physicality, touch, and intimacy were very evocative to me, and quite sort of it gave a different perspective on that sort of very hyper macho romanticization of boxing. And I just want to read it's a beautiful book as well. Um, but I was going to read a very sort of simple excerpt. Really, it's like, so he's just finished sparring with someone he's really struggling with. Struggling in the sense that the person he's sparring with is better than him, and he's just not having a great time. Um, and if an alien had landed in that boxing gym and had to describe the behavior of male humans, surely it would have concluded that we touched each other as much in love as in violence, that the former, in fact, inspired the latter. If anything appeared innate, it would surely be the affection between us. Um, and just as a sort of sideline, if you are interested in amateur, I really, really recommend the audiobook as well, because Thomas's reading of it is fantastic. Andy? Again, there's so much in the book to get into, and I think one of the things that when you read something where you like I read it and I sort of it's one of those books I have in like three formats, Kindle, audiobook, and physical, and so I can sort of experience it in different ways. But there's like one bit in it where I was just like, oh shit, there was just like an insight. And so throughout the book, he tells the story of the training and all the characters he meets, and obviously the fight itself. He tells a little bit of the story of his own experience and his own backstory. Not too much about that, but a little bit of that. And it's also peppered with research and interviews he's done with sort of masculinity scholars and so on. And in one of those, he talks about how the sort of two different, one of the people he's interviewing talks about how how do people define becoming a man? It's like becoming a man is that you're no longer a boy. So that's one sort of like a rites of passage interpretation or understanding of being a man. But then he contrasted that very much with a sort of 20th century American idea of being a man is defined in opposition to not being a woman. And that sort of starkness of that contrast and the power dynamic and the all the downside that comes with that, and the disempowerment that comes with that was very striking when I sort of heard that for the first time. And yeah, that was just what I wanted to mention. Andy? I think so. I was running a bit late, so I'll rattle through this last two. I think if you're interested in, I came to this book sort of as a sort of new dad, and I was interested in like understanding like what being a dad was, and what like, and I think I found a lot of succor and nourishment from this book, because I think Thomas talks very much around how there is a cultural norm around what masculinity is, and the way he expresses like that that masculinity is one thing is absolutely a myth, and there's an opportunity for or there is a diversity of modes of masculinity and ways in which that is expressed, and that was very valuable to me through the book. And finally, Andy, I just sort of and finish with a meta point really, is that the book's actually really short. Like it feels a bit like the book, it feels a bit like a poem, and it feels a bit like the fight itself. An amateur fight is 3 rounds of 2 minutes. It's very short. It goes in and out. If you watch some video footage of Thomas actually fighting in that fight, his style, he goes in and out. He's quick, but like, and that's what this book feels like. It's like almost like I feel like he was trying to. The form of the story is the form of his fighting style. It's the form of that fight itself. It's the form of. There's just a lot of beauty in the way the story is constructed, and I really appreciated that. It's not really explicit, but it felt like the form was absolutely the right way to. I've read a lot of non-fiction books where they outstay their welcome, and it's just got in and out, hit you, hugged you, and then left. And I think I really appreciated that. So that's my piece.
Thanks so much.